Professor Chan is the School of Education of Deakin University and an Australian Research Council Future Fellow. Prior to joining Deakin in July 2013, Professor Chan worked at Monash University and RMIT. She was academic at Quay University prior to coming to Australia. Professor Chan's research focuses on international education, international students, education migration nexus, Australian student mobility to the Indo-Pacific, and internationalization of higher education in Vietnam. Her work has been featured in multiple languages and media outlets in Australia and internationally. Thank you so much for being with us today, Professor Chan. I look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you for the introduction.
We can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm very delighted to have the opportunity today to share with you some insight into international education, especially the reciprocal international relationship between Australia and Vietnam, and geopolitics and the impact of geopolitical tension on international education, and some key takeaway messages for internationalizing higher education. So I'm very glad to share with you what I've learned in this space. And first of all, I would like to share my screen. Okay, so can anyone let me know if you can see my screen?
If you could just bear with us a moment, we're just connecting you to. Apologies.
That's okay. Thank you.
We have you now. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you for facilitating that. So I'm speaking from wintry Melbourne, and I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of the country. Up with echoing. Can you hear that? Yeah, I don't know why I'm echoing. I can hear my voice back. I don't know if there is something wrong with the so I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I reside, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. And as I mentioned before, the topic of my presentation today is on international education and geopolitics, and I would like to discuss the shift for Vietnam from being a passive recipient of international education to a proactive partner and an emerging provider of international education, especially in relation to short-term mobility. And in my presentation, I would like to focus on these key points. I would like to start first with some emerging characteristics of international education, and then I will move on to talking about the impact of geopolitics and the role of geopolitics in international education in Vietnam, with reference to China and a couple of other countries. And that will be followed by the Vietnam and Australia international education development discussion. And I would like to wrap up with some key takeaways and recommendation of food for thought first. So let me begin by looking at the broader context of international education. We can see international education has been constantly changing and it has been increasingly business focused. So we have heard a lot of debates and discussion about the business model of international education and the commercialization of different forms of international education. So not just international student recruitment, but also transnational education and research collaboration, for instance. And over the past decades, especially since COVID-19, we have seen how international education has been increasingly subject to public policy changes, not just in the international education sector, but in other sectors, for instance, migration. And in countries like Australia, we see how the nexus between international education and migration has impacted on the recruitment of international students, especially from Indo-Pacific countries. And we have seen policy in workforce in post-study work rights. So post-graduation opportunity to work have impacted on international education and in particular international student recruitment, especially in Australia, but also in Canada and New Zealand and the UK and US. And we have seen how economic policy affected international education. And since COVID-19, it has been so clear that international education is vulnerable to crisis, including global financial crisis, the pandemic, COVID-19, the war, Ukraine and Russia war, and the implication for transnational relationship and international education, and natural disasters, for instance, bushfire in Australia, and the support for international students, and especially geopolitics. I will talk a bit more further in my presentation. And we have seen a trend that has been quite becoming quite clearly is that international education is no longer just oriented for education purpose or business orientation, but also it lies more closely with political interests that come along with economic interests. And I also articulate a bit more later in my presentation. So in terms of geopolitics, if we look at the global context, we have seen the development of far-right parties in several European countries, the Brexit phenomenon and the Trump administration, and how national protectionism, inward-looking nationalism, and anti-migration, anti-globalization, and anti-multiculturalism have led to rising opposing of the development of international education, and also increasing racism toward international students in some countries. And we have seen a trend of how international education, which was has been traditionally seen as a tool in order to maintain peace, regional harmony, and regional cooperation, has been weaponized and used it as a political tool in the context of rising geopolitics. And clearly, international education is also subject to geopolitics in the sense of China's rising power and the growth of India, as well as the potential, whether India can have the potential to rebalance the power, and what is the implication for international relation, international cooperation, and also international education. But we also see emerging middle powers like South Korea, Iran, Brazil, and that open up a multipolar world system. And within Asia, clearly countries like China, Malaysia, Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong are increasingly using international education and especially transnational education as a means in order to exercise power and and create regional influence and global influence. And we some examples are related to the growth of educational hubs in China, Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Now, if we look at China, we have clearly see an example about how China has been quite aggressive in developing strategy that take advantage international education and use it as a tool in order to enhance the country's influence and its position in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, as well as globally. A couple of projects that I would like to cite here is project 211 that aims to build domestic higher education and foster national economy, but also leverage transnational education in research for the development of science and technology in China. And that is followed by project 985 that aims to improve Chinese higher education international ranking through not only aggressive investment in improving the quality of the higher education sector, but also supporting the transnational collaboration of Chinese institutions with foreign institutions. And one of the distinct strategy used by the Chinese government in order to create geopolitical power and international student recruitment and exercise influence in the region is the bringing policy that aim to attract international students to China, whether to take full degree or in intra-degree mobility or to study Mandarin or Cantonese. A well-known policy by China is the Belt and Road Initiative, and part of that is the provision of the Zero Scholarship Program and the increase in investment in research, again to serve the geopolitical goal of the Chinese government in relation to international education, regional influence, and soft power. And as a result of this aggressive policy, China has witnessed a tenfold increase in the number of international students in Chinese university over the 20-year period, I believe, from 1995 until 2015, alongside with other development in soft power and regional and global influences. Okay, so basically we synthesize three ways that China has used international education to exercise soft power, regional and globally. So the first one is through partnership with foreign universities in terms of inbound and outbound mobilities, research collaboration. And the second one is related to the first one in the sense that there is significant increase of funding for research conducted in foreign university. So not just research conducted in foreign university within the Indo-Pacific region, but also we have seen increasing Western university turning to China for funding for their research. And the third one is to set up offshore campuses, and we have seen campuses of Chinese university and institution in Laos, Malaysia, Thailand, Japan, and Hungary. And another phenomenon, quite distinctive feature of geopolitics and international education in China strategy is the establishment of Confucius Institute across the world, and the development of language school and scholarship for students to study in China. So whether to study a particular field of study or languages. And by 2017, there was around 516 Confucius Institute and around 1,076 Confucius classroom in primary and secondary school in 143 countries and regions, and that number has decreased now. But a difference between Confucius Institute established by China and the British Council, the other education scheme by the British Council, the Alliance Française, and the Goethe Institute of Germany, is that those the Confucius Institute often assist within university campus, while for the others, they are located outside university campus. Okay, so I would like to quickly talk about COVID-19 and how geopolitical tension have been escalated during the COVID-19 and especially between Australia and China, and the implication for international education and the UK. So many of us are aware that the Australian government opposed a range of foreign policy by the Chinese government, and at the beginning of COVID-19, we have seen the Australian government call for an independent investigation into the origin of COVID-19. And then we have seen repeated responses of the Australian government to oppose China response to Hong Kong security law, to Taiwan independence, and to China escalation in South China Sea. And in response, China has warned their students from traveling to Australia to commence their study or to return to resume their study. And they have cited reasons including threats of racial attack, discrimination, and position Australia at an unsafe destination. And together with that warning is a threat to divert thousands of Chinese students from Australia to the UK if Australia is persistent or consistent with their opponent messages, if they do not change their political position. And so in 2020, UK has witnessed an increase by 9% in the number of non-European, non-EU international students as a result of global politics, including the tension between Australia and China, but also as a result of the introduction or reintroduction of post-study work rights that have significant implication for international student employment opportunities and also their education quality. Okay, so now I would like to focus more on the context of Vietnam. So international education in Vietnam has been closely shaped and reshaped by the historical, economic, and political circumstances of the nation. So internationalization of education occurs in Vietnam when Vietnam was colonized, dominated, occupied, and controlled by foreign countries. But at the same time, the country of Vietnam resisted those forces and have tried to adapt the education system to be more suitable to the local context. So there's the tension between being colonized and influenced by foreign forces, and at the same time resistant and localizing. And that trend has been quite distinctive in international education in Vietnam that I will be able to share a bit more. Okay, now I would like you to write in the chat box three words that come to your mind first in response to this question: why do we need to internationalize higher education? So if we have about 30 seconds to write that in the chat box. Yep, so maybe if any of you could unmute and share with me some of the common words that appear in the text in the chat box in response to the question, why do we need to internationalize higher education? Sorry, I couldn't see the chat box from my end. Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
I think there are some people commenting.
Yes, can you share with me, please?
Sure, yeah. Can we share that?
Yes. Okay, you
It's
just
just
read
in the
aloud.
chat box. Can you see the chat box?
I can't see from my end. Yeah.
Ah. Let's have a look. I could ask you.
Relevance. Yeah.
Sorry, you have it?
Yeah, I have it. So we can see that here. Relevance, benchmarking, contextualization, that excellent response, and I think it aligns with some of the rationales for internationalizing higher education. And now let's have a look at the context of Vietnam. Okay, so if we look at the Vietnam National Strategy for Education Development 2011 and 2020, we have seen that the expansion of and enhancement of international cooperation commonly seen as one of the key trends of international education in Vietnam, being positioned by the government as one of the key 8 fundamental initiatives to reform the education system. And looking at the National Strategy for Education Development 2020 and the development over the past few years, we can see that internationalization has been used by MOAT and higher education institution in Vietnam as a vehicle in order to enhance quality of the higher education system, to allow the system to catch up with regional and international developments in quality, and to lift international capacity and institutional ranking, to foster international cooperation. And this point is really quite distinctive in the context of Vietnam. When we do comparative study, you can see that international education in Vietnam has been geared toward international cooperation in a very clear trajectory, and a strengthened business model for a growing number of institutions in Vietnam. But the overall aim that is often articulated in policy is how internationalization of higher education can open up the opportunity for integration, for regional and world integration, and for human capacity building for the nation. Okay, and here the key primary dimension of internationalization of higher education in Vietnam that we summarized in our book about internationalization in Vietnamese higher education. So we can see inbound and outbound student mobility and staff mobilities, but mainly outbound mobility. But we can start seeing some growth in inbound mobility that I will talk more in a minute, and international cooperation in program development and delivery, internationalization of the curriculum, and one of the typical program is the advanced program, and the use of English as a medium of instruction has been seen as a strategic tool for internationalizing higher education in Vietnam, and the development of different forms of transnational education, including JOIS and twinning program. But with COVID-19, we have seen more creative form of hybrid and a blended model of transnational education in Vietnam, and the establishment of international school and institute And transnational research collaboration is also a key dimension too. Now, if we look at geopolitics, I would like to share an example about student mobility related to Vietnam, and that set Vietnam quite a unique position because I think it's one of the first schemes in the story of student mobility that were destructive to the aim of the sponsoring countries. So we know that the first French troops entered Vietnam in 1958 and withdrew from Vietnam in 1954 after the Dien Bien Phu battle. And during the French colonization, the optimal purpose of education in Vietnam is to educate a generation of Vietnamese in order to serve the colonial aspiration of the mother country. In this case, is the French government. And as I mentioned, that relationship in terms of student mobility has been counterproductive to sponsoring country, because one of the key strategy for the French government to set up a generation of Vietnamese who can serve the aspiration or the ruling of the French government is to sponsor Vietnamese scholars and students to study overseas in France, to learn about the foundation and the superstructure of French civilization. But that generation of scholars who were educated in France also had the opportunity to be exposed to the ideology and ideas about independence, freedom, and nationalism. And they become progressive minded and actively promoted nationalism while in France and coming back to Vietnam. So they became the leading force that led Vietnam to stand up and fight against colonization. And that led to the end of French colonization in not only Vietnam, but Indochina, in Laos and Cambodia. So it's quite a distinctive mobility scheme in the history, but it shows that there is a close relationship between geopolitics and student mobility and international education, not just now or during COVID-19, but back, nearly a decade ago. And Vietnam is also quite distinctive in the way it articulates geopolitical agenda and political agenda in education policy. So coming back to the policy that I mentioned earlier, the strategy for education development for Vietnam 2020, it articulates clearly how education serves the nation diplomatic and political agenda. But also back, if we look back at the education law in 2005, the key statement is the goal of education are to educate Vietnamese into well-rounded citizens so that they can be loyal to the ideology of national independence or nationalism and socialism, and develop the capacity to defend the motherland. And these messages were consistently translated into the revised education law in 2019, and we argue that Vietnam represents a unique country again, where the ideology of national independence and defense of the fatherland have been weaved into the government narrative on the purpose of contemporary higher education. Okay, now I change the topic a bit by looking at Australia and Vietnam. So talking about geopolitics, the Australian government also positioned the development of international education with Vietnam to serve not only economic purpose, but also as a tool to build bilateral relationship with Vietnam through student mobility in both ways, through transnational education and transnational research collaboration. And one of the new schemes introduced by the Australian government and mentioned in the new Australian strategy for international education 2030 is the international skill training. So it can be delivered in partnership with local training providers, and Vietnam has been identified as one of the key countries to focus on in the scheme of international skill training, alongside with Indonesia, Malaysia, India, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, and South Korea. So that is a form of transnational education that look at the development of critical skill identified in the partner countries, and have the capacity to be contextualize the content to suit the partner country. So it is a form of transnational education, but it linked to using vocational education and higher education linkage in order to build stronger bilateral relationship between Australia and partner countries, including Vietnam as the target country. And in articulating about Australia and Vietnam international education, a couple of key things that have been highlighted in the discussion and debate is how both countries can leverage the development of digital technology and opportunities in transnational education and student mobility, and capitalize on the shift to online and blended learning, especially during COVID-19, but also to respond to the demand for transnational education. So we have seen that prior to COVID-19, internationalization at home, it was not prioritized by institutions in Australia compared to internationalization abroad. But with COVID-19, there tend to be a higher demand for internationalization at home due to border closed in the early stage of COVID-19, and also the hesitation to travel. So the opportunity to do transnational education at home at a more affordable price, but also getting international recognized qualification have been widely recognized. And also another key thing is the demand for critical skill area and the need for upskilling and reskilling in partner countries, including Vietnam. And the changes in transnational education regulation in partner country like Vietnam, and I will talk about that change in a minute. But if we look at the global landscape, the online learning market is predicted to grow from $200 billion to more than $370 by 2026. So again, it comes back to the point of the opportunity to leverage the demand of e-learning and digital technologies. So in Australia, a couple of new courses have been introduced in international and transnational education. Is the micro credentials targeted at international students to meet identified skill gaps, and also the critical skill courses in partner countries, as I mentioned earlier. So what is the implication for Vietnam in relation to its developments? So we have seen that as of 2021, there were 424 transnational education program in Vietnam, and it is an increase from around 300 program in 2018 and 130 program in 2007. So a significant increase across 2007, 2018, and 2021. But we also see alternative T&E models. And in terms of mobility, we have seen the growth in Vietnamese institution in providing short-term mobility programs for countries like Australia, the UK, and US, and neighboring country in the Indo-Pacific. For instance, between Australia and Vietnam, short-term mobility, we have seen that Vietnam grow from an eighth top destination country for Australian students under the New Colombo Plan in 2016 to a fourth destination country in 2019. So Vietnam is quite a popular study abroad destination for Australian students, but there is a bit uneven development across different institutions in Vietnam. So some institutions are quite active and are quite successful in developing themselves as provider of short-term mobility for Australian students, but some are not that effective. And increased transnational research collaboration. As I mentioned earlier, that marked a shift from Vietnam as a merely passive recipient to of international education to an active partner and an emerging provider of international education. Yeah. So I mentioned earlier about alternative model of transnational education. So we see that Vietnam is the first country in Asia to allow foreign provision of online and blended degree courses in partnership with Vietnamese university. It is a very brave move, and it happened during COVID-19, leveraging digital technology and the shift to online and blended learning. And there were 5 Australian universities involved in this pilot scheme, and clearly MOAT set a quota on how many students can be enrolled in this online and blended degree courses. So we see the phenomenon of Vietnamese students as being online international students but study at home, which is quite interesting. So they are graduating with internationally recognized qualification, but at a more affordable rate. It also opportunity to have students to be exposed to international practices and internationally recognized content, but at the same time develop localized knowledge and skill, because the lack of localized knowledge and skill for international students have been identified as an area that needs improvement for key destination countries like Australia, the UK, US, and Canada. Okay, so in terms of curriculum development, we have seen the development of the advanced program, and it reached MOAT target of having at least 30 advanced programs across the sector by the end of 2015. And the target was met 3 years earlier than planned. And with the advanced program, we have seen faculties at participating university have been, facility have been upgraded and improved significantly. Another key development is Vietnamese academics and students exposed to internationally recognized curriculum delivered in partnership with foreign university and often top tier university in US, UK, and Australia. Also, the cohort of students who are enrolled in the advanced program would have opportunity to enhance their English proficiency and employability, because the program is delivered using English as the medium of instruction. And the advanced program have been used by many universities as a mechanism to strengthen the partnership between Vietnamese and foreign university. But a couple of key takeaways that I would like to summarize that in relation to the internationalization of the curriculum through importing the advanced curriculum or advanced program from foreign university to Vietnamese university. One of the key question is how the Western and external education models and practices have been appropriated to be suitable for the local needs in a country like Vietnam. And the question of whether it is creative borrowing or passive borrowing. And the question of how reciprocal learning in transnational internationalization of the curriculum rather than just one-way learning or one-way import of foreign curriculum into the Vietnamese context. And what is the process of de-Westernization of practice? And where is the role and the opportunity to use Vietnamese values, Vietnamese practice at capital or resources in teaching and learning in those advanced program or internationalized curriculum, and the issue of equity and sustainability in the advanced program, because we all know that the fee is quite high for local students. So it raised the question of equity and access. Okay, so I nearly come to the end of my presentation. So we have seen that international education has supported Vietnam to realize its political and diplomatic agendas, including the aspiration for regional and world integration. But there are significant steps to move forward in terms of considering the strategic area for Vietnam higher education in the field of international education, including how to build and foster Vietnam education brand in the region and in the world. At the moment, for me, in terms of focusing on full degree offering for international students in Vietnam, it's more strategic to invest in building Vietnam as a regional hub for short-term mobility and semester mobility, including virtual mobility. For instance, the short-term mobility that I mentioned earlier about the New Colombo plan, and Australian students seeing Vietnam, choosing Vietnam as the fourth study abroad destination is quite promising. And in addition to short-term mobility, I could recommend looking at regional language courses. So offering in-country language courses, not just in Vietnamese, but in other regional language and even English if possible. And we have seen that FPT have been quite active in offering English for Japanese students, for instance. And also consider to strategically delivering not only traditional transnational program in partnership with foreign country like bachelor or master program, but also emerging critical short courses such as international skill training in response to critical skill shortage area, and micro credential, as I mentioned, internship for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and hybrid mobility program that combine the focus on content knowledge delivery, but also cultural introduction in Vietnam, and leverage the opportunity afforded by digital technology and online and blended learning that I mentioned earlier. But I think most importantly, Vietnam needs a more coordinated approach where Vietnamese universities collaborate to build Vietnam's international education brand together, because at the moment, as I mentioned, some universities are really proactive and doing quite well in this space, but some other are still behind the game. And one of the main things is that good practices and initiatives and programs are not widely shared, so that there is an opportunity to develop a community of practice and work together in building Vietnam brand. And there need to be better coordination across education, tourism, foreign affairs, economics, and finance sector in supporting the development of Vietnam international education. And there need to be a national strategy from my perspective for internationalization and specific action plan and framework to facilitate the implementation of internationalization. And of course, we have seen a lot of dodgy practices and drawbacks in ensuring quality in international education in Vietnam. So an area that needs a lot of work and careful monitoring is regulatory framework for quality assurance and accreditation. And I'll wrap up again with a note that good practices in designing and implementing internationalization activity and program in inbound and outbound mobility research, transnational education at the institutional level across different regions of the nation should be disseminated and promoted through a more holistic channel. And I think I'll wrap up here with a thank you note, and I welcome any questions and feedback.